14 hours in brutal cold. No stage, no cameras chasing clout. Just Bumpy Johnson, Harlem's most feared name, standing outside on Thanksgiving Day in 1963, making sure hungry families ate. This isn't the version of Bumpy Johnson you usually hear about, and that's exactly why this story matters. Real quick, drop a comment and tell me where you're watching from, and if you appreciate true, well, researched history. Make sure you subscribe. A lot of effort went into digging through real accounts and separating facts from legend for this story, and your support helps keep these untold stories alive. In 1963, Harlem was carrying the weight of decades of economic neglect, and by Thanksgiving that year, the struggle was impossible to ignore. Jobs were scarce, rent was high, and many families lived paycheck to paycheck, if they had a paycheck at all. Factories that once offered steady work had closed or moved, and discrimination kept many black residents locked out of better, paying opportunities elsewhere in the city. For a lot of households, survival wasn't about long-term plans, it was about getting through the next day. Unemployment hit Harlem especially hard. Young men stood on street corners not because they wanted to, but because there was nowhere else to go. Even those who worked often earned wages that barely covered food, let alone heating costs, as winter approached. Thanksgiving, a holiday centered on abundance, only sharpened the contrast between what America celebrated and what Harlem residents actually experienced inside their apartments. Housing conditions added another layer of hardship. Many buildings were overcrowded, poorly maintained, and dangerously cold during the winter months. Landlords routinely ignored repair requests, and families relied on space heaters or improvised solutions just to stay warm. For elderly residents and children, the cold wasn't just uncomfortable, it was dangerous. Hunger and exposure often went hand in hand. Food insecurity was widespread, especially during holidays. Government assistance programs were limited and slow, and community charities were stretched thin. Thanksgiving meals, which required extra money for ingredients, were simply out of reach for many families. Parents were forced to make quiet, painful choices about who would eat and how much, while trying to preserve some sense of dignity for their children. The broader national mood didn't help. 1963 was a year marked by civil rights protests, racial tension, and the assassination of President John F. Kennedy just days before Thanksgiving. While the country mourned publicly, Harlem mourned privately, grieving not only national tragedy, but the daily losses caused by poverty and neglect. Trust in institutions was low, and many residents felt forgotten by the systems meant to protect them. Despite these conditions, Harlem maintained a strong sense of community. Neighbors looked out for one another, churches organized what little aid they could, and word traveled fast when help was available. Mutual support wasn't optional, it was necessary. Survival depended on shared resources and unspoken understanding between people facing the same struggles. It was within this environment that any act of generosity carried enormous weight. In a place where hardship was routine and hope often felt distant, showing up for the community meant more than charity, it meant recognition. Understanding Harlem's economic struggle in 1963 is essential because it explains why actions taken that Thanksgiving resonated so deeply and were remembered long after the cold faded. By 1963, Bumpy Johnson was already a legend in Harlem, but his influence reached far beyond the criminal reputation most people knew him for. To many residents, he wasn't just a gangster. He was a familiar presence, someone who had grown up in the same streets and understood the unspoken rules of survival. People saw him not only as a power broker, but as someone who operated within Harlem rather than above it. Bumpy's authority came from more than fear. He had relationships with business owners, street figures, and community members that allowed him to move resources quickly and quietly. When disputes arose, his word often carried more weight than the law, especially in neighborhoods where police presence was viewed with suspicion. That influence gave him the ability to solve problems in ways official institutions could not, or would not. What set Bumpy apart was his complicated sense of responsibility toward Harlem. He saw the neighborhood as his home, not just his territory. Stories circulated about him helping families pay rent, stepping in to protect locals from outside threats, and ensuring elders were treated with respect. These acts weren't publicized, but they built a reputation that mixed fear with loyalty. Bumpy also understood the psychological side of power. He knew that visibility mattered, especially in a community that felt ignored. When people saw him walking the streets, talking directly to residents, it sent a message that someone with influence hadn't forgotten them. That presence reinforced his standing, not just as a figure to be feared, but as one who acknowledged the struggles around him. At the same time, Bumpy never pretended to be a saint. Harlem residents were fully aware of how he made his money and the violence tied to that world. But for many, morality wasn't black and white. It was measured by who showed up when it mattered. In a system that offered little protection, someone willing to step in could earn respect regardless of their past. His influence also extended into moments of crisis. Whether it was mediating conflicts or providing help during hard times, Bumpy was often faster and more decisive than official channels. That responsiveness built trust, especially among those who had been failed repeatedly by authorities and social programs. By 1963, Bumpy Johnson had become a symbol of contradiction, a criminal who commanded respect, a feared man who could also be generous. Understanding this dual role is key to understanding why his actions carried so much weight in Harlem, and why people paid attention when he chose to act in the community's interest. Thanksgiving was not a random choice for action in Harlem. It was a day loaded with meaning. Across America, the holiday represented gratitude, family, and full tables, images that were heavily promoted in media and tradition. In Harlem, however, those images often felt distant, almost mocking, because so many families faced the reality of empty kitchens and unpaid bills. Choosing Thanksgiving meant confronting that contrast head-on. For people struggling to survive, holidays can deepen hardship rather than relieve it. Children heard about Thanksgiving meals at school or saw them on television, while parents worried about how to explain why their own table looked different. The emotional weight of the day made hunger more visible and more painful. Any act of generosity on Thanksgiving wasn't just about food, it was about dignity. By acting on that specific day, Bumpy Johnson tapped into something deeply human. Feeding people on Thanksgiving sent a message that they were not invisible, that someone recognized the gap between what the country celebrated and what Harlem endured. It acknowledged the emotional side of poverty, not just the physical need. That recognition mattered as much as the meals themselves. Thanksgiving also carried symbolic power as a moment of pause. Businesses slowed down, offices closed, and attention shifted away from daily routines. In that stillness, action stood out more clearly. A food distribution on an ordinary weekday might have gone unnoticed, but on Thanksgiving, it became a statement, one that spread quickly through word of mouth. There was also a quiet challenge embedded in the choice. Thanksgiving is traditionally associated with generosity, unity, and shared abundance, values often praised but inconsistently practiced. By stepping in on that day, Bumpy's actions highlighted the failure of institutions that spoke about care and community, yet left entire neighborhoods struggling. The contrast was impossible to ignore. For the people receiving food, the timing mattered deeply. It allowed families to participate in the holiday, rather than merely survive it. Sitting down to a Thanksgiving meal, even a simple one, restored a sense of normalcy and inclusion. It reminded people that they deserved moments of celebration despite their circumstances. In the end, Thanksgiving transformed the act from charity into symbolism. It turned a food distribution into a statement about belonging, recognition, and shared humanity. That is why the day itself became inseparable from the story, because the meaning of the moment amplified the impact of what was done. The decision to personally oversee the food distribution was deliberate and revealing. Bumpy Johnson could have easily funded the effort and stayed out of sight, allowing others to handle the logistics while his name carried the credit. Instead, he chose to be physically present, understanding that presence itself carried meaning. In a neighborhood used to empty promises, showing up mattered as much as the food. By overseeing the distribution himself, Bumpy ensured that the operation ran smoothly and fairly. There would be no favoritism, no skimming, and no intimidation of those coming for help. His presence discouraged interference and kept order without the need for force. People knew that if Bumpy was there, the line would move, and everyone would be treated with respect. There was also a deeper message in him, standing among the people rather than above them. He wasn't watching from a distance or issuing instructions from a warm location. He stood in the same cold, faced the same wind, and experienced the same discomfort as everyone else. That physical shared hardship erased barriers between giver and receiver, even if only for a moment. For many residents, seeing him there created a sense of trust. Harlem had long learned to be cautious of outsiders who came in with charity and left with praise. Bumpy was not an outsider. His presence confirmed that this wasn't a publicity move or a temporary gesture. It was something rooted in familiarity with the community and its needs. Personally overseeing the distribution also allowed him to interact directly with people. Short exchanges, nods of recognition, and quiet words carried weight. These moments humanized both sides of the interaction, reminding people that they were seen as individuals, not statistics. Those brief connections often stayed with people longer than the meal itself. There was an element of accountability as well. By being there, Bumpy tied his reputation directly to the success of the effort. If something went wrong, it reflected on him personally, That willingness to accept responsibility reinforced the idea that he stood behind his actions, not just his image. In the end, his decision to oversee the distribution in person transformed the event into something more than organized aid. It became a shared experience, one that reinforced trust, visibility, and connection. That choice is a key reason the moment endured in Harlem's memory long after Thanksgiving 1963 had passed. Standing outside for 14 hours in freezing weather was not a symbolic gesture, it was a physical test of endurance. Late November in New York brought biting winds, numb fingers, and long stretches of waiting that felt endless. The cold settled into the bones, making every minute feel heavier than the last. This wasn't a brief appearance or a quick walk through. It was an all-day commitment that demanded stamina and resolve. As the hours passed, the temperature dropped and the crowd grew. Families arrived in waves, some early in the morning, others later after hearing about the food through neighbors and friends. The line moved slowly, not because of disorder, but because care was taken to make sure everyone was served properly. That meant more standing, more waiting, and more exposure to the cold for everyone involved. Remaining outside, that long sent a powerful message to the community. Many people offering help preferred warmth and distance, checking in briefly before retreating indoors. By staying the entire time, Bumpy Johnson showed that he wasn't measuring his effort by comfort. The cold became part of the sacrifice, reinforcing the seriousness of what was being done. Physically, the strain was real. Hands stiffened, breath turned visible in the air, and fatigue set in as the day wore on. There were no heaters, no breaks inside, no escape from the weather. Each hour required a conscious decision to stay, to endure discomfort for the sake of those still waiting in line. For the people receiving food, seeing someone remain outside that long changed how the act was perceived. It didn't feel like charity handed down from a distance, it felt shared. The cold affected everyone equally, dissolving some of the separation between the one giving and the ones receiving. That shared hardship created a sense of mutual respect. Time also played a role in building trust. 14 hours is long enough for skepticism to fade. Anyone looking for attention or praise would have left early, but staying until the end proved commitment. As the day stretched on, word spread that he was still there, still standing, still making sure no one was turned away. By the time the last meals were handed out, the cold had left its mark, but so had the effort. Enduring 14 hours outside wasn't just about toughness, it was about consistency and follow-through. That endurance became one of the most remembered parts of the story, because it showed that the action wasn't rushed, staged, or half-hearted. It was seen through to the very end. The locations in Harlem where food was distributed were carefully chosen to maximize reach and impact. Bumpy Johnson didn't limit the effort to a single street corner or one familiar block. Instead, the distribution took place at multiple points where the need was greatest, including crowded tenements, community centers, and areas where families were known to struggle the most during the holidays. Each spot was strategically selected to ensure as many people as possible could benefit. These locations were more than just logistical points, they were symbolic. Many of the neighborhoods targeted were historically overlooked by city services, and residents often felt invisible to both government agencies and charitable organizations. By bringing food directly to these areas, Bumpy sent a clear message. He recognized the people who were often forgotten, and he intended to meet them where they were. The sites were also accessible to the majority of Harlem residents. Narrow streets and alleyways were familiar to locals, allowing them to navigate quickly and safely. Organizing the distribution in these familiar areas reduced confusion and kept the flow of people orderly. This practical consideration made the effort more efficient, but it also reinforced the sense that this was a homegrown, community-centered initiative. At each location, there was a sense of anticipation. Word had spread beforehand through neighbors, friends, and local networks, so crowds began forming even before the first meals were ready. These gatherings became more than just queues for food. They became spaces of social interaction, moments where people exchanged news, offered encouragement, and shared in the small relief of having someone look out for them. The logistics of moving food between locations were complex. Coordinating volunteers, ensuring enough supplies, and maintaining quality all required careful planning. Yet, Bumpy's familiarity with the neighborhood and his network of trusted contacts made it possible. His presence at multiple sites ensured that the operation ran smoothly and any issues could be addressed immediately without delays or confusion. Being present at multiple locations also amplified his visibility and influence. Families recognized him at each stop, and the act of showing up repeatedly reinforced the sense of personal commitment. People weren't just receiving food. They were seeing someone invest time, effort, and presence in their well-being, which strengthened the bond between him and the community. Finally, the choice of locations shaped the story's legacy. By serving food in the heart of the neighborhoods most in need, the action became part of the collective memory of Harlem. Residents remembered not only the meals themselves, but the attention to detail, the thoughtfulness in placement, and the clear effort to reach as many people as possible. That careful selection of sites ensured the Thanksgiving of 1963 would be remembered long after the day ended. The number of people fed during that Thanksgiving in 1963 was staggering, especially considering the harsh conditions and limited resources. Estimates vary, but eyewitness accounts suggest that hundreds of families, spanning children, adults, and the elderly, received meals that day. For many, it was the only substantial meal they would have for Thanksgiving, making the act all the more significant in a neighborhood where hunger was a daily reality. Feeding such a large number of people required careful planning and organization. Bumpy Johnson and his team had to account for the quantity of food, the pace of distribution, and the flow of people moving through multiple locations. Each meal was prepared with the intent of being sufficient and nourishing, ensuring that even the last person in line would not leave empty-handed. This level of consideration reflected both foresight and commitment. The scale of the effort also amplified its symbolic impact. In a community long overlooked by charitable organizations and government programs, the sight of so many people being served by one individual was remarkable. It was a vivid demonstration of what could happen when someone with influence decided to take action, showing the community that support could come from within, not just from external authorities. Families receiving the meals expressed gratitude in ways both subtle and profound. Children clutched plates with wide eyes, elders nodded with quiet appreciation, and parents often offered heartfelt words of thanks. The act of feeding so many people became more than a logistical task. It became a deeply personal interaction that left lasting impressions on both givers and receivers. The effort also had a ripple effect throughout Harlem. Word traveled quickly from block to block, drawing more people who needed assistance and inspiring others to contribute where they could. Seeing so many individuals serve created a sense of communal participation, reinforcing the idea that collective effort, even when led by one person, could make a tangible difference. Moreover, the act of feeding hundreds highlighted the scale of need in Harlem. It forced the community and later historians to confront the reality of widespread poverty and food insecurity. The visibility of the effort underscored both the generosity of Bumpy Johnson and the systemic challenges that left so many residents dependent on extraordinary individual efforts for basic sustenance. By the end of the day, the impact of feeding such a large number of people extended far beyond the meals themselves. It created a story of endurance, compassion, and accountability that resonated in Harlem for decades. Those who were there remembered not only the food, but the dignity, care, and presence that accompanied it, cementing the Thanksgiving of 1963 as a defining moment in the neighborhood's history. Community reactions and eyewitness accounts from that Thanksgiving reveal just how deeply Bumpy Johnson's actions resonated in Harlem. People who were there recalled a mix of surprise, relief, and awe. Many had heard of Bumpy's reputation as a tough and feared figure, so seeing him dedicate an entire day to feeding the poor challenged their expectations. It was a moment that blurred the lines between fear and respect, leaving a lasting impression on anyone who witnessed it firsthand. Eyewitnesses often emphasized the atmosphere of the day. Despite the cold, there was a sense of energy and organization as people formed lines and helpers distributed meals. Children ran with excitement, parents juggled plates and bags, and neighbors quietly shared what little they could with each other. Accounts consistently highlight that Bumpy was visible throughout, greeting people, ensuring fairness, and quietly managing logistics to prevent confusion or conflict. Residents also remarked on the novelty of seeing someone of Bumpy Johnson's stature working directly among them. For many, he was a figure they had only known through stories of power and crime. Seeing him standing in the cold alongside them, personally handing out food, reshaped their perception of who he was and what leadership could look like in their community. Local church leaders and community organizers took note as well. They recognized the scale and effectiveness of the effort, praising the dedication and forethought that went into feeding so many families. Some accounts describe volunteers and neighbors feeling inspired to contribute in small ways, whether by helping carry food, guiding families, or offering extra support where it was needed. The media at the time, though limited in coverage, reported on the unusual juxtaposition of Bumpy Johnson's feared reputation and his acts of generosity. Articles highlighted both the number of people served and the unusual sight of a notorious figure personally distributing meals. For Harlem residents, This duality reinforced the complex nature of leadership and influence in a neighborhood often ignored by mainstream society. Eyewitnesses also remembered small, human moments that illustrated the personal impact. A child tugging at his coat to get closer, an elder quietly thanking Bumpy, or a young mother balancing a plate while calming her children. All of these moments added depth to the story. They demonstrated that the effort was not just logistical, but profoundly human, connecting individual experiences to a broader act of community care. Ultimately, the community's reaction cemented the day as more than just a charitable act. It became a story of accountability, trust, and dignity. Residents remembered not only the meals they received, but the sense that someone powerful had chosen to recognize and value them, creating a memory that would persist in Harlem's collective consciousness for decades. Bumpy Johnson's relationship with Harlem's poor was complex, but deeply rooted in mutual understanding and respect. Despite his criminal reputation, he had grown up in the neighborhood and experienced many of the same hardships as those around him. This personal connection gave him insight into the struggles of everyday residents, from families worried about paying rent to children going to bed hungry. He wasn't an outsider imposing help. He was someone who knew the streets and their challenges firsthand. His actions often reflected a sense of responsibility toward the community. While many figures of power in Harlem focused on maintaining influence or pursuing profit, Bumpy recognized that stability and trust depended on more than fear. By helping those in need, feeding the hungry, settling disputes, or protecting vulnerable residents, he strengthened his social bonds and reinforced the idea that he could be relied upon when official systems failed. For the poor of Harlem, Bumpy's support was both practical and symbolic. Practical, because he provided food, money, or assistance when there was nowhere else to turn. Symbolic, because his involvement sent a message that their struggles were being acknowledged. That acknowledgement carried immense weight in a neighborhood where people often felt ignored by the broader city and government institutions. The relationships were built over time and through repeated acts. Families remembered him intervening in disputes, offering advice, or quietly helping with emergencies. Even small gestures like checking in on a neighbor or ensuring someone was treated fairly in a local business contributed to a reputation that went beyond crime. It created trust and a sense of security that few other figures could provide. Bumpy's approach was also strategic. By cultivating positive connections with the community's most vulnerable, he reinforced his standing as a leader who was both feared and respected. People understood that his authority came with accountability. If he promised help, he delivered. This balance of power and care distinguished him from other figures in Harlem who relied solely on intimidation. The Thanksgiving food distribution of 1963 exemplified this relationship. By standing in the freezing cold and personally overseeing the distribution, Bumpy showed that he was willing to invest time and effort into the well-being of the poor. The act was not just charity, it was a reaffirmation of the bond he maintained with the community and a demonstration of his commitment to their welfare. Ultimately, Bumpy Johnson's connection with Harlem's poor was defined by visibility, action, and empathy. He understood their struggles, engaged directly with their needs, and created a network of trust that transcended his criminal identity. This relationship allowed him to wield influence in a way that was both practical and profoundly human, making moments like the Thanksgiving of 1963 unforgettable for the people he served. The contrast between Bumpy Johnson's public image and his private actions has always fascinated historians and Harlem residents alike. To the outside world, he was primarily known as a feared gangster, a figure tied to crime and violence, with a reputation that inspired both respect and caution. Media portrayals emphasized his power on the streets and his involvement in organized crime, creating a narrative that left little room for nuance. Yet within Harlem, many witnessed a very different side of Bumpy Johnson. People who lived in the neighborhoods he moved through knew him as someone who cared about the well-being of his community. While he enforced rules and demanded respect, he also fed the hungry, protected vulnerable residents, and intervened when authorities failed. This duality, criminal by reputation, caretaker by choice, was central to understanding his influence. The Thanksgiving of 1963 highlighted this contrast in a dramatic and undeniable way. Here was a man feared for his criminal dealings, yet he spent an entire day standing in the freezing cold to feed the poor. The image of Bumpy handing out meals personally challenged the public perception of who he was and what motivated him. It forced people to reconcile the harsh realities of his criminal life with acts of genuine generosity. This duality made Bumpy a complex figure in the collective memory of Harlem. He was both a symbol of toughness and a figure of compassion. Residents often spoke of him with a mix of reverence and caution, understanding that his authority came from a combination of force, intelligence, and a willingness to act when others would not. That blend made him uniquely capable of commanding both fear and loyalty. The contrast also affected how stories about him were told and remembered. While crime-focused narratives dominated newspapers and court records, oral histories emphasized his role in community care. Parents would tell children about the time Bumpy helped feed families on Thanksgiving, while simultaneously acknowledging his dangerous side. This layered storytelling preserved the complexity of his character in ways that official records could not. Importantly, this contrast influenced the neighborhood's understanding of leadership and power. People saw that influence could be exercised in more than one way, through control and enforcement, but also through care and accountability. Bumpy's actions demonstrated that a leader could command authority while still recognizing and responding to the needs of the community. By balancing his feared reputation with acts of tangible generosity, Bumpy Johnson created a lasting legacy that defied simple categorization. The Thanksgiving of 1963 served as a vivid example of this balance, showing that even those painted in broad strokes by public perception could perform acts of profound humanity. It was this contrast that ensured the story of Bumpy Johnson remained more than a tale of crime. It became a story about responsibility, recognition, and connection to one's community. Word spread quickly through Harlem on that Thanksgiving of 1963, and the speed at which people learned about Bumpy Johnson's food distribution reflected both the tight-knit nature of the community and the respect he commanded. In a neighborhood where news traveled by word of mouth, neighbors told neighbors, and soon entire blocks knew that help was arriving. The reputation of the man behind the effort ensured that people paid attention and showed up. The spread of information created anticipation. Families lined up early, some hours before food was even available, hoping to ensure they would receive a meal. The act of showing up in advance also became a social ritual. People checked on friends and family, exchanged tips on timing, and offered assistance to one another while waiting. The excitement and curiosity built momentum throughout the day, reinforcing the communal nature of the event. As word traveled, it wasn't just residents who noticed. Local businesses, churches, and community leaders became aware of the effort, and many quietly supported it by helping carry food, guiding people to distribution points, or providing small donations. This network of informal communication and support amplified the impact, making the distribution more organized and efficient than it might have been otherwise. The spread of news also contributed to the symbolic power of the event. People realized that someone with influence and notoriety had chosen to recognize their struggles publicly. The story of Bumpy standing in the cold to feed the hungry became a narrative that neighbors shared for years afterward, reinforcing a sense of pride and belonging. It wasn't just the meals themselves, it was the act of acknowledgement that resonated. Eyewitnesses later recounted how the line for food seemed to grow as more people heard about the distribution. Those who had been skeptical or unfamiliar with Bumpy's reputation began to attend, curious and eager to witness the event. By the time the day was halfway over, the scale of participation had far exceeded initial expectations, illustrating the power of trust and communication in a community that relied heavily on informal networks. The rapid spread of word also created a ripple effect of inspiration. People who had never been involved in such efforts felt motivated to help in small ways, whether by volunteering to hand out food, assisting neighbors, or even just sharing the story with others. The simple act of informing the community became part of the collective memory, as important as the meals themselves. Ultimately, the speed and reach of word of mouth in Harlem ensured that Bumpy Johnson's Thanksgiving effort became a defining moment. It was a story not only of generosity, but also of connection, how one person's actions, amplified through the community, could touch hundreds of lives in a single day. The narrative of that day endured precisely because it spread quickly, creating shared memories and a lasting sense of unity. By the time the last meal was served on that cold Thanksgiving of 1963, the impact of Bumpy Johnson's actions had already begun to shape his legacy in Harlem. People didn't just remember the food, they remembered the effort, the presence, and the personal attention he gave to each recipient. The act became a defining story of his life, one that contrasted sharply with his public image as a feared figure in organized crime. The day demonstrated that leadership could take many forms. While Bumpy had long commanded respect through influence and reputation, this effort showed that genuine authority could also be rooted in care and accountability. Residents saw that power wasn't only about control or intimidation. It could also be about stepping up when the community needed someone the most. His actions left an enduring mark on the community's memory. Families recounted the story to their children, neighbors shared details with friends, and local oral histories preserved the account of his personal involvement. The Thanksgiving of 1963 became a reference point for what it meant to serve the community, illustrating that even amidst hardship, acts of generosity could inspire and unite people. The legacy extended beyond those present that day. Stories of Bumpy's commitment spread through Harlem and eventually into broader accounts of his life, creating a more nuanced understanding of him as a figure who combined toughness with compassion. This balance made his story compelling, showing that complex individuals could have both flawed and admirable qualities. Over time, the memory of that day contributed to the mythos of Bumpy Johnson, blending fact and legend in ways that captured the imagination of future generations. People remembered not only the meals and the endurance required to distribute them, but also the message behind the act, that even someone associated with crime could choose to act for the benefit of others. The Thanksgiving effort also reinforced community bonds. Residents who experienced the distribution firsthand felt a strengthened sense of solidarity, pride, and mutual care. The shared experience of receiving help while seeing someone of Bumpy's stature dedicate himself to the effort created a collective memory that transcended individual families, embedding itself into Harlem's cultural and historical narrative. Ultimately, the Thanksgiving of 1963 became a defining chapter in Bumpy Johnson's legacy because it illustrated a side of him that few outside the community would have expected. It wasn't just a story about feeding the hungry. It was a story about accountability, visibility, and the profound impact that one person could have on the lives of many. It ensured that Bumpy Johnson would be remembered not only for his power, but also for the moments when he chose to wield it in service of others.